Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really complex project, sometimes controversial, but, well, undeniably pivotal. It sits right at the crossroads of global trade, energy, geopolitics. We're talking about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, and its crowning jewel, the Gwadar Port. Now, we've gathered a pretty insightful stack of sources for you. It's quite a mix: geoeconomic assessments, academic journals, news reports, deep analyses from various think tanks. Our mission today, really, is to cut through the noise, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, and help you understand the many, many layers of this ambitious initiative.
Yeah, and what's truly compelling here is how CPEC and Gwadar Port, they aren't just about, economic development on paper. They represent this nexus of strategic ambitions, regional challenges, and some very specific local realities. We're going to explore the widely differing perspectives on its success, its impact, aiming for a comprehensive view, but, without totally overwhelming you with detail.
Right. And you'll hear about incredible potential benefits, definitely, but also some stark, really undeniable challenges, from these grand visions of regional connectivity all the way to intense local protests and, yeah, serious allegations of a debt trap. We're going to cover it all. So as we go through this, the big question for you to consider is, what does all this truly mean for China, for Pakistan, and for the broader region? Okay, so to really get our heads around CPEC, we kind of have to rewind a bit, back to its origins. It was publicly announced back in 2013. Initially, it was seen as, well, a relatively straightforward infrastructure project, just connecting China and Gwadar port roads, railways, pipelines, that sort of thing. At that time, the projected cost was pretty modest, relatively speaking, maybe $10 to $20 billion, and a 5-year timeline. These manageable.
It did seem manageable at first, yeah. But that changed quickly. In April 2015, President Xi Jinping visited Pakistan. And these activities, they were reframed, officially named CPEC, and the focus shifted significantly, dramatically really, towards power production. That alone just skyrocketed the projected costs. Suddenly, $46 billion. Then came this long-term plan, pushing the timeline out to 2030, and anticipated expenses soared again, $62 billion. Some Pakistani authorities even quoted higher numbers.
Wow. That's a huge jump, both in scope and cost.
Yeah.
So what were the big picture goals? What was driving this monumental shift? For Pakistan, the idea seems clear enough. Modernize its crumbling infrastructure, create a mechanism for sustained economic development, as they put it. Basically leveraging China's vast financial resources, its industrial capacity, its tech know-how. It was about solving their chronic energy crisis, upgrading transport networks.
Exactly. And for China, it was really at its heart about getting a crucial direct connection to the Arabian Sea. This offers a secondary economic route, a sort of bypass, you could say, to the potentially dangerous Malacca Strait in Southeast Asia. That's a narrow sea lane, vital for global shipping, but, vulnerable. Geopolitical tensions, piracy even. So this direct access to the Indian Ocean through Gwadar, it's of immense strategic importance for Beijing, especially for its oil imports from the Middle East. Think about this. Around 40% of China's imported oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is less than 500 kilometers from Gwadar. That's an incredibly efficient route.
So it's really about much more than just trade then. China also saw CPEC as an essential strategic commitment to ensure stability in its western regions, maybe act as a balance to India and South Asia, and even address potential training grounds for Uyghur separatists from Xinjiang. But, okay, if the primary aim was prosperity for Pakistan, did the way the project was structured always align with that?
That's a very sharp question. And some sources definitely point out a potential disconnect there. While the financial drive is undeniable, that primary aim of bringing prosperity to Pakistan, sometimes it seems at odds with how the project is structured. Chinese firms, for instance, have often secured these long-term contracts at fixed prices, prices significantly higher than market rates. Now, this arrangement, sure, it guarantees returns for China, but it could potentially put Pakistan at a competitive disadvantage in the long run.
That sounds like potentially a heavy financial burden for Pakistan to bear down the line. Let's talk specifics about the benefits, though, the ones touted in the sources. One of the absolute biggest goals was solving Pakistan's chronic energy crisis. That keeps coming up. With what, an overwhelming 76% of CPEC projects focused on energy. China planned to invest about $34 billion to build an additional 17,000 milliW of capacity. Just the initial projects were expected to provide up to 10,400 milliW. That's a huge number for a country constantly battling power shortages.
It really is.
Yeah.
And beyond energy, CPEC was intended to bolster Pakistan's overall economic growth. Picture this. The modernization of the Karachi to Peshawar Railway, that's a high priority project. It's expected to boost passenger travel speed from like 65 kilometers up to 160.
Wow.
Think of it like going from a sort of leisurely local train to a proper high-speed service, and projections even suggested Pakistan's merchandise exports could climb to $58 billion annually. That's a threefold increase over previous levels.
Okay, that sounds incredibly ambitious, truly transformative if it all pans out. The promise was also bringing development to many rural parts of Pakistan, Balochistan, for example. Despite being the poorest province, it was expected to see the largest increase in its social welfare index, like 6.4% growth. And Gwadar Port itself, well, that was meant to reduce Pakistan's reliance on Karachi Port. Karachi handles over 60% of its maritime trade, right? And it's vulnerable, being so close to the Indian border. We saw that in past conflicts. So Gwadar is almost like building a backup superhighway for their trade.
Definitely. Now, shifting to the Chinese perspective, Gwadar's significance, it extends far beyond just commerce. It's undeniably seen as a geostrategic center for China's economic, political, maybe even future military actions in the North Indian Ocean. And China's commitment is pretty evident. Actions like converting a $230 million loan for Gwadar Airport into a grant back in 2015, or an interest-free $140 million loan for a highway connecting Gwadar to the coast. They're investing deeply, you can see it.
And some reports even anticipate China might establish its next overseas military outpost at Gwadar, following its base in Djibouti. If that were to happen, how significant would that be? In terms of lessening its reliance on Malacca, maybe allowing it to monitor things like the Quad, the US, India, Japan, Australia Forum?
Oh, that would be incredibly significant. Game-changing, really. It would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape of the Indian Ocean, giving China this persistent presence, enhanced naval reach, right in a crucial global waterway.
Okay. This brings us inevitably to one of the most fiercely debated aspects of CPEC, the whole debt trap narrative. On one hand, you have reports highlighting Pakistan's liabilities reaching nearly 30 trillion rupees. That's what, 86% of its GDP back in 2018, far exceeding its own fiscal limits. And by 2023, China accounted for 22% of Pakistan's external public debt, roughly $28.78 billion. So the numbers, well, they certainly look alarming.
Yeah, they do look alarming, yeah. And some sources are very blunt about it. They state that the CPEC investments weren't grants. They were steep, unforgiving, and increasingly unsustainable loans. They claim 80% of the financial risk fell squarely on Islamabad. Meanwhile, Chinese firms were guaranteed these exorbitant dollar-denominated returns up to 34% in the energy sector, which became a crushing burden as Pakistan's currency depreciated.
Wait, hang on. 91%. 91% of Gwadar Port's revenue going to Chinese state-owned enterprises. That figure just jumps out as astonishing. How does Pakistan justify that? And what are the long-term implications of such a disproportionate split, especially if China is reportedly refusing to restructure or defer payments because they fear setting a precedent?
It feeds directly into that debt trap argument, doesn't it? One report indeed asserts that Gwadar Port operates under these, quote, lopsided agreements. The implication is clear. Pakistan gets the infrastructure, sure, but the financial benefits, they flow disproportionately out of the country. However, this is exactly where the narrative becomes truly contested, really complicated. Because another perspective, from a study using data from international agencies, CPEC authorities, it directly contradicts this. They argue that 80% of CPEC initiatives are actually equity-based, meaning a minimal debt burden on the government itself. So the core insight here isn't a simple yes or no to the debt trap idea. It's more about understanding that CPEC's financial architecture is just fundamentally interpreted differently depending on the lens you use. It highlights this deep mistrust, these divergent narratives swirling around Chinese investment.
Okay, so the counterargument is essentially that Pakistan's debt problems, they existed long before CPEC. They stem from systemic issues, stagnant growth, poor fiscal management, not solely from CPEC. And that same study you mentioned says Gwadar's CPEC projects specifically are primarily funded through grants, not loans, which challenges that blanket debt trap label people often apply to the whole corridor.
Yeah.
It paints a very different picture.
It absolutely does, a very different picture. And this complexity, it isn't just about high finance in Islamabad or Beijing. It has real, tangible impacts on the ground, especially in Balochistan. Now, this is Pakistan's largest province geographically, yet it's also its poorest, lowest GDP per capita. And despite having vast natural resources, the local Baloch people often feel marginalized, exploited.
Yes, and there's a long history of resistance in Balochistan, isn't there? Insurgencies driven by grievances over political marginalization, economic exploitation, cultural suppression. This context is absolutely crucial because anti-China sentiment is surging there, and it's directly impacting CPEC projects. We've seen significant protests, groups like the Balochistan Committee, the Haq Do Tariq, mobilizing against perceived injustices and forced disappearances. Leaders like Marouane Balochistan explicitly linked Chinese investments to alleged human rights abuses, which just further inflames that anti-China feeling.
Yeah, and a key flashpoint is definitely the fishing community in Gwadar. It comes up again and again. Despite supposed local bans on illegal trawling, the local fisher folk, they face intense competition from these big international vessels, including Chinese ones. They're losing their livelihoods. And this, combined with the fact that, as you mentioned, that huge percentage of Gwadar Port's revenue goes to Chinese state companies. Well, it's fueled these widespread protests demanding basic amenities, clean water, electricity. It really brings home the point, doesn't it? For all the billions invested, the human cost, the livelihood of a simple fisher folk can just get overlooked in these grand geopolitical schemes.
And tragically, this unrest, it's led to a rise in attacks on Chinese nationals, on Chinese interests. Groups like the Balochistan Liberation Army, the BLA, they've claimed responsibility for attacks. They view Chinese investments as exploitation and Chinese workers as targets. We're talking about serious incidents, like the 2019 attack on that luxury hotel in Gwadar, or a convoy of Chinese engineers attacked in Karachi just in October 2024.
What's particularly concerning, I think, is that these attacks are coming from both sides, so to speak. Ethno-nationalist groups like the BLA and Islamist groups like the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP.
Right.
That's the umbrella group of various Islamist militant organizations along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So while Balak militants see China as a kind of colonial usurper, the Islamist groups cite different reasons China's support for the Pakistani government, the alleged suppression of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, different motives, same targets.
And it's not just, cross-border terrorism filtering in. Some recent reports indicate suicide bombers in Balochistan have been educated, middle-class citizens, including women. That points to deeper issues, doesn't it? Things like political repression, economic deprivation. Suggesting that just military responses alone, they aren't enough. It's almost like trying to build a highway through a minefield if you don't address those underlying issues first.
Indeed. And the increasing operational influence of the TTP in Balochistan, especially since the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021, that's also a significant factor. TTP has apparently expanded into new areas, absorbed local armed groups, they've adopted tactics like suicide bombing, and they've got access to more advanced weaponry coming out of Afghanistan.
And on top of all that, we even hear about Chinese companies stopping electricity generation in CPEC projects because of unpaid arrears over 300 billion Pakistani rupees, apparently, causing new power crises in Pakistan. There's also frustration, seemingly on both sides, about project delays. China reportedly reluctant to release pledged funds for some infrastructure pieces. It's even led to some Pakistani politicians apparently considering abandoning CPEC entirely if, say, the U.S. were to offer similar financial help.
It really highlights a crucial point. Progress is far from smooth. These persistent security concerns, the project delays, they demonstrate that the grand vision faces immense practical challenges on the ground. And that overwhelming focus on energy within CPEC, while it definitely highlighted Pakistan's acute power crisis, the payment arrears suggest maybe a potential over-reliance on just one sector, perhaps at the expense of more diversified, long-term economic development.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting as we start to wrap up. CPEC and Gwadar Port, they're clearly much more than just infrastructure projects, aren't they? They feel like a litmus test for this delicate balance between grand strategic visions and the actual tangible impact on local communities. We've seen the immense potential for economic growth. For instance, addressing Pakistan's energy crisis, that promise of up to 10,400 MW of electricity. That's huge. And the visions of modernizing the railway system, increasing passenger speed from 65 to 160 kilometer readers, potentially tripling merchandise exports. These are genuinely transformative promises.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we've learned about the profound strategic significance for China. That enhanced Indian Ocean access, the potential alternative to the Malacca Strait for its vital oil imports, and even the possibility, however speculative, of a future military outpost near the Strait of Hormuz, where, remember, 40% of its imported oil passes. Yet, this same project is plagued by these accusations of being a debt trap. Concerns about high interest rates, that staggering 91% of Gwadar Port's revenue supposedly going to Chinese state firms. But, as we discussed, others strongly contend that 80% of CPEC initiatives are equity-based. They argue Pakistan's debt issues predated CPEC, stemming from existing structural problems. So maybe the real debt trap isn't just the numbers themselves, but the conflicting narratives surrounding them, which makes it incredibly difficult to find common ground or a clear way forward.
Yeah, exactly. And let's not forget the ground reality, especially in Balochistan, Pakistan's largest and poorest province, where that anti-China sentiment is surging. We heard about the genuine grievances driving protests from groups like the Balochistan Committee and the Hakdo Tehrik, fueled by claims of resource exploitation, lack of local benefits like that fishing community losing livelihoods to Chinese trawlers, the Gwadar Hakdo movement demanding basic amenities. It highlights these persistent unmet needs, and this deep-seated unrest, tragically, has led to attacks on Chinese nationals and interest, with groups like the BLA and even the TTP claiming responsibility or increasing their presence. It's such a powerful reminder that even the grandest projects can falter if local populations feel excluded or exploited.
Which raises a really important question, I think. The ongoing project delays, like the Chinese companies stopping electricity generation due to those massive unpaid arrears alongside the persistent security concerns, it all demonstrates progress is far from smooth, and the increasing involvement of even educated middle-class individuals in militancy, that points to deeper issues. Beyond simple cross-border terrorism narratives, it hints at grievances like political repression, economic deprivation, things that require genuine political engagement, not just military responses. The strategic importance of CPEC is undeniable, but so are the very real, very complex obstacles on the ground.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this. In a world driven by these grand geopolitical strategies, these multi-billion-dollar investments, how do we truly measure development and progress? Is it solely in the new trade routes created, the sheer scale of the investment? Or is it ultimately found in the equitable distribution of benefits, the genuine upliftment of local communities, and achieving true peace on the ground? What do you think is the most critical factor for the long-term success of such ambitious corridors?